The convoy had no warning whatsoever. During a freezing morning in 1943, somewhere deep in the mountains of Norway under Nazi control, 15 German military trucks carrying ammunition, various supplies, and soldiers started moving down a twisting road that clung to the side of a cliff. The drivers carefully followed the arrows displayed on the traffic signs, the very same signs they had been relying on for many weeks. However, on this specific morning, those arrows were telling lies. Each truck turned precisely where the signs directed them to turn. And each truck, one after another, sailed straight off the edge of a 200-foot drop into a ravine packed with sharp rocks and frozen water below. The wind swallowed their screams. The valley carried the echoes of the explosions. And the individual responsible for this massive destruction was not some commando, not some spy, not even a battle-hardened resistance fighter. He was a Boy Scout, just 15 years old. This is the story they concealed in the margins of World War II. While history gives recognition to the beaches of Normandy and the factories of the Ruhr Valley, it overlooked the small sabotage operations that took place in the shadows of occupied Europe, executed by teenagers who were meant to be learning knots and camping techniques. This boy's name has disappeared into history, erased from official records through a combination of fears about Nazi retaliation and embarrassment after the war ended. But the action itself, verified by Norwegian resistance archives and German military documentation, stands as one of the most daring and straightforward acts of defiance throughout the entire war. By the time this video concludes, you will grasp how a child armed with nothing except courage and a wrench succeeded in killing more enemy soldiers during a single morning than some complete resistance cells managed to kill in an entire year. Norway, in 1943, had become a frozen prison. The nation had fallen to the Wehrmacht in 1940, conquered through a blitzkrieg campaign lasting merely 2 months. The Nazis required Norway for its coastline, its ports, and its pathway to the iron ore mines located in Sweden. They occupied every significant city, put puppet governments in place, and transformed the Norwegian countryside into a state under constant surveillance. Checkpoints materialized on every road. Curfews confined families within their homes. Quisling, the Norwegian traitor whose name became synonymous with collaboration itself, governed from Oslo, while the actual power remained in Berlin. For the typical Norwegian family, existence became a sequence of minor humiliations and major fears. Food faced rationing, radios were seized. Speaking out against the Reich meant a one-way trip to a labor camp or a bullet somewhere in the woods. But in the remote mountains, distant from the watchful eyes of Gestapo headquarters, life proceeded at a different rhythm. Small villages hung onto the hillsides, linked by narrow roads that wound through pine forests and along the edges of cliffs. These roads served as the arteries of the occupation. Daily, German convoys transported supplies from the coast toward the interior, sustaining the machinery of control. The local population observed these convoys passing with silent hatred burning inside. But what options did they have? The soldiers possessed machine guns. The villagers possessed farming tools. Resistance appeared utterly impossible. That is precisely what made the Boy Scouts so dangerous. They were invisible. They were severely underestimated. And they knew every single inch of those mountain roads better than any German officer could ever hope to know them. The boy in this story resided in one of those villages, a cluster of wooden houses that likely contained fewer than 200 people. His father held a job at the local mill. His mother maintained a small garden that barely yielded enough to survive the strict rationing. Prior to the war, he had belonged to the local scout troop, devoting weekends to hiking the trails and acquiring wilderness survival skills. When the Germans arrived, the scout troops received official orders to disband. The Nazis feared any organization that taught young people about independence and resourcefulness. But the boys continued meeting in secret, gathering in barns and forest clearings, and the lessons carried on. They learned to move without making a sound. They learned to interpret the land. And most critically, they learned that the Germans, despite all their efficiency and brutality, were outsiders in these mountains. They depended on the roads. They placed their trust in the signs. And that trust, the boy came to realize one winter night, could be transformed into a weapon. The idea arrived while he watched a convoy move through the village square. He observed how the drivers never paused at the intersections, never stopped to verify their route. They simply followed the arrows painted on the wooden traffic signs. These signs lacked sophistication. They had no guards. They were simply pieces of wood attached to posts, indicating left or right, up or down, and they were absolutely essential. One incorrect turn on these mountain roads did not result in a detour. It resulted in death. The cliffs dropped straight down into valleys where rescue was impossible. The boy grasped that if he could alter just one sign at precisely the right intersection, he could send an entire convoy to its destruction. The risk was massive. If caught, the Germans would not merely kill him, they would execute his entire family as a warning to others. But the opportunity presented itself perfectly, and the anger burning within him, the anger from watching his country suffer beneath the boot of the Reich, proved stronger than his fear. The plan developed gradually over several weeks as winter intensified and the convoys continued rolling. The boy started studying the German routes with the concentration of a general planning a military campaign. He would rise before dawn and position himself within the forest, overlooking the main road, concealed among the pines, observing which convoys traveled at what times. He detected patterns. The supply trucks invariably moved on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. They traveled in groups ranging from 10 to 20 vehicles. They moved rapidly, attempting to cover as much distance as possible before nightfall rendered the mountain roads even more dangerous. Most significantly, he identified the critical intersection, a fork in the road, roughly 5 miles outside his village, where one path continued safely along the ridge and the other curved sharply toward what the locals referred to as Devil's Drop, a cliff that plunged 200 feet straight down into a gorge filled with rocks and ice. The Germans always selected the safe route. The sign at that intersection directed them away from danger. But that sign consisted of just wood and nails, and the boy possessed both a wrench and a burning death wish for the occupiers. The risk extended beyond simply changing the sign. The risk encompassed everything surrounding it. The Germans patrolled these roads continuously. They maintained watchtowers at strategic locations. They employed local informants who would betray their neighbors for an extra bread ration. If anyone witnessed the boy tampering with the sign, if anyone reported suspicious activity near that intersection, the Gestapo would descend upon the village like a pack of wolves. They would assemble every male above the age of 12 and begin shooting until someone provided a confession. That was their approach. That was their method of maintaining control. Fear served as their currency, and they distributed it liberally. But the boy also understood something the Germans failed to comprehend. He knew that the forest belonged to him, not to them. He had devoted years to hiking these trails, discovering which paths remained visible from the road and which stayed hidden. He knew where the patrols walked and when they rotated shifts. He knew that on certain nights when the wind screamed down from the peaks, even the most dedicated sentry would retreat into the warmth of a guard shelter rather than freeze in the open air. Those nights represented his window of opportunity. He selected a night in late January, when the temperature plummeted below zero and a storm descended from the north. The wind howled through the trees, bending them nearly in half. Snow fell with such thickness that visibility dropped to nearly nothing. It was the type of night when even the Germans remained inside, when the patrols were cancelled and the guard towers stood vacant. The boy informed his parents he was heading to bed early, then slipped out through his bedroom window, carrying a rucksack containing a wrench, a small lantern, and a knife. He moved through the village like a phantom, remaining in the shadows, avoiding the main street where German soldiers occasionally gathered. Once he reached the tree line, he felt more secure. The forest absorbed him. The storm erased his tracks as rapidly as he created them. He moved swiftly but cautiously, following a route he had committed to memory during his weeks of observation. The intersection lay 3 miles away, through thick woods. In favorable weather, the hike required 45 minutes. In this storm, it consumed nearly 2 hours. When he finally arrived at the intersection, the wind roared so loudly he could barely hear his own breathing. The sign stood at the fork in the road, a basic wooden post displaying 2 arrows, one indicating left toward safety and one indicating right toward the cliff. Both arrows were blanketed in snow and ice. The boy retrieved his wrench and started working on the bolts, securing the sign to the post. His hands went numb within minutes. The metal had frozen solid. The bolts resisted turning. He worked slowly, methodically, battling the impulse to rush. If he damaged the bolts, if he broke the sign, the Germans would detect the tampering and become suspicious. It needed to appear natural. It needed to appear as though nothing had been altered. After 20 minutes of struggling, the first bolt broke free, followed by the second. He lifted the sign from the post, rotated it 180 degrees, and secured it back in position. Now the arrow that had indicated toward safety pointed toward death. The arrow that had warned away from the cliff now beckoned the trucks forward. He stepped back and inspected his work. In the darkness and snow, it appeared flawless. It appeared untouched. It appeared as if it had always existed this way. The hike back to the village proceeded faster because adrenaline overpowered exhaustion. He reached his house before dawn, climbed back through his window, and concealed his wet clothes at the bottom of his closet. When his mother woke him for breakfast, he pretended to be drowsy, pretended that he had slept through the entire storm. But internally, his heart was pounding. He had completed it. The trap had been set. Now all he could manage was to wait for the convoy to arrive and hope that his calculations proved accurate. He did not need to wait long. The Germans were nothing if not extremely punctual. Tuesday morning arrived cold and clear, the type of brutal mountain clarity where the sky becomes so blue it almost hurts to observe, and every sound travels for miles. The boy woke early, his stomach twisted into knots. He could not consume breakfast. His mother inquired if he was feeling sick, and he lied, saying he was fine, merely tired from the storm. He walked to school with the other village children, but his mind was not focused on lessons. It was focused on that intersection 5 miles away, on that reversed sign, standing in the snow, waiting. He knew the convoy schedules. If the pattern held, the trucks would depart the coastal depot at 7 in the morning and reach the fork in the road around 9:30. He sat in his classroom, staring at the clock on the wall, watching the hands advance forward with agonizing slowness. 9 o'clock came and went. 9:15, 9:20. At 9:25 he heard it, a low rumble in the distance growing louder, the unmistakable sound of heavy diesel engines grinding up the mountain road. The teacher was writing something on the chalkboard about Norwegian history, about the kings and queens of the old days, the irony of which was not lost on the boy. Here they sat, occupied and controlled, learning about a past that felt like fiction, while the present roared past their windows. The sound of the convoy intensified. The boy could distinguish individual truck engines now, could hear the squeal of brakes as the vehicles navigated the sharp curves. Other students started to notice, heads rotating toward the windows. The teacher stopped writing and listened. German convoys were commonplace, but something about this one felt different. It was larger than typical. The sound continued and continued, truck after truck after truck. The boy counted in his head. 10 vehicles, 15, 20. It was a major supply run, perhaps one of the largest of the winter. His hands began to shake. He gripped the edge of his desk to stabilize himself. If this worked, if the sign accomplished what he intended, he was about to kill dozens of German soldiers, possibly more. The weight of that realization struck him like a physical impact. The convoy passed through the village without stopping, a long serpent of green canvas and black iron winding its way up the mountain road. The soldiers in the trucks appeared bored, cold, wrapped in heavy coats, smoking cigarettes, staring at nothing. They had completed this run dozens of times. It was routine. It was safe. They possessed no reason to suspect that a 15-year-old boy with a wrench had transformed their safe route into a death sentence. The sound of the engines started to fade as the convoy climbed higher into the mountains, heading toward the intersection. The boy glanced at the clock again. 9:45. The intersection was 15 minutes away at convoy speed. He felt like he was going to be sick. He wanted to run from the classroom, to sprint up the mountain and tear the sign down, to halt what he had initiated. But he could not move. He could only sit there frozen, listening to the sound of the trucks growing fainter and fainter until they vanished entirely into the distance. The classroom settled back into its usual rhythm. The teacher resumed the history lesson. Students opened their notebooks and pretended to care about dead kings. But the boy could not hear any of it. His mind was in the forest, watching an invisible clock countdown to the moment when the lead truck would reach the fork in the road, and the driver would look at the sign and turn the wheel. He imagined it frame by frame, the truck turning, the driver realizing too late that the road was ending. The moment of panic, the scream, the fall, then the second truck following, then the third. How long would it require before one of the drivers realized what was happening? How many trucks would go over before someone applied the brakes? He did not know. He had not thought that far ahead. He had only thought about revenge, about striking back, about making the Germans pay for what they had inflicted on his country. But now, sitting in that classroom with his heart hammering in his chest, he understood that he had just committed an act of war. The explosion, when it arrived, was distant but unmistakable. A deep rolling boom that echoed through the valley, followed by another, then another. The sound was not continuous. It arrived in waves, each blast separated by a few seconds, like fireworks at a festival, except there was nothing festive about it. The classroom went silent. Every head turned toward the windows again. The teacher's face went pale. One of the girls started crying. Everyone in that village knew what an explosion on the mountain road signified. It signified an accident. It signified death. It signified the Germans would come searching for someone to blame. The boy sat perfectly still, his face carefully neutral, even as his entire body screamed with terror and triumph. It had worked. The sign had worked. The convoy was gone. The explosions continued for nearly 10 minutes, a symphony of destruction that rolled across the mountains like thunder. Each blast was the sound of a truck striking the rocks below, its fuel tank rupturing, its ammunition cargo detonating in a chain reaction of fire and metal. The boy sat in that classroom listening to the sound of his own handiwork. And with each new explosion, the reality of what he had accomplished became more concrete and more terrifying. He had anticipated 1 or 2 trucks going over before the convoy halted. He had not anticipated this. He had not anticipated the entire line of vehicles following each other into the abyss like lemmings. Each driver trusting the truck ahead, each one assuming that if the lead vehicle turned that direction, it must be safe. The Germans, despite all their military precision and discipline, had walked straight into the trap with their eyes wide open. Their dependence on order and routine had become their death sentence. Within an hour, German military vehicles started flooding into the village. They arrived fast and angry. Soldiers jumping from trucks before the vehicles even came to a complete stop, their weapons drawn, their faces contorted with rage and confusion. The villagers were ordered from their homes at gunpoint and assembled in the village square. Women clutched their children tightly. Old men stood with their hands raised. The boy stood with his classmates, attempting to appear as frightened and confused as everyone else, which was not difficult because he was genuinely terrified. An officer started shouting in broken Norwegian, demanding to know if anyone had witnessed anything suspicious, if anyone had been near the mountain road, if anyone possessed information about sabotage. The word sabotage hung in the air like a guillotine blade. The Germans knew. They had already visited the intersection. They had already seen the reverse sign. They knew this was not an accident. They knew someone in this village, or one of the surrounding villages, had declared war on the Reich, and they were going to locate that person even if they had to burn every house to the ground. The interrogations commenced immediately. The Germans established a command post in the village hall and started pulling people in one by one. They questioned the men first, the ones who might possess the physical strength to climb to the intersection and alter the sign. They asked about movements, about alibis, about who had been where during the storm. They brought in dogs to search for tracks leading from the village to the forest. They examined boots for mud and clothing for tears. The boy observed all of this happening from across the square, his mind racing through every detail of his journey to the intersection, attempting to remember if he had left any evidence behind. He had worn his oldest boots, the ones with worn soles that left no distinctive pattern. He had buried his wet clothes. He had told no one, not even his closest friends. But the storm had occurred 2 nights ago. Snow had fallen since then. His tracks would be covered. The dogs would find nothing. He repeated this to himself like a prayer over and over, attempting to believe it. His turn arrived in the late afternoon. 2 soldiers escorted him into the village hall, where a Gestapo officer sat behind a desk, smoking a cigarette and studying a map of the area. The officer was young, perhaps 30, with cold blue eyes and a scar across his left cheek. He looked at the boy the way someone might look at an insect, with casual contempt and mild curiosity. The questions started simple. Name, age, where do you live? Where were you 2 nights ago? The boy answered in a quiet voice, maintaining his story simple and boring. He had been home. He had gone to bed early due to the storm. His parents could verify this. The officer wrote nothing down. He simply watched the boy's face, searching for the telltale signs of lying, the dart of the eyes, the sweat on the forehead, the tremor in the hands. But the boy had trained for this without realizing it. Years of hiding in the forest, years of observing animals and learning to move without disturbing them, had taught him patience and control. He met the officer's gaze without flinching. He kept his breathing steady. He became boring. After 15 minutes of questioning, the officer waved him away with disgust. The boy was merely another peasant child, too young and too stupid to execute something this sophisticated. The Gestapo was searching for an adult, probably someone with military training, maybe a former Norwegian soldier or a resistance operative who had infiltrated the area. A 15-year-old scout was beneath suspicion. The boy walked from the village hall on shaking legs, past the other villagers still waiting to be questioned, and headed home. He did not run. He did not glance back. He simply walked, 1 foot in front of the other, until he reached his house and closed the door behind him. Only then, alone in his room, did he allow himself to breathe. He had survived the first test, but he knew the Germans would not cease. They would keep searching. They would keep questioning, and sooner or later someone might remember seeing something, might piece things together, might point a finger in his direction. He had won the battle, but the war for his own survival had only just begun. The German investigation consumed the village for 3 complete days. Soldiers went door to door, searching attics and cellars, looking for evidence of resistance activity. They confiscated tools that could have been used to remove the sign, wrenches and hammers, and anything metal. They photographed the boots of every male in the village, creating a catalogue of sole patterns to compare against any tracks they might discover. They brought in engineers to examine the reversed sign itself, checking for fingerprints, for tool marks, for any microscopic clue that might lead them to the saboteur. But the storm had performed its work too well. The snow and ice had scrubbed the sign clean. The tracks leading to and from the intersection had been buried beneath 2 feet of fresh powder. The Germans possessed a crime scene. They had bodies being pulled from the ravine. They had twisted metal and burned cargo scattered across the rocks, but they had no suspects. The frustration was visible on their faces, a simmering rage that threatened to boil over into indiscriminate violence at any moment. On the fourth day, the executions commenced. The Germans decided that if they could not locate the guilty party, they would punish the community as a whole. They selected 10 men at random from the village and the surrounding farms, lined them up against the wall of the church, and shot them in front of the entire population. The message was clear. This is the price of resistance. This is what occurs when you strike at the Reich. The boy watched it happen from the crowd, forced to stand there with everyone else, forced to witness the consequences of his action. He recognized some of the men. One had been his teacher before the war. Another had worked alongside his father at the mill. They died for something they did not do, their blood staining the snow in front of the church, and the boy had to stand there with a neutral expression. Had to watch without crying, without screaming, without confessing. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, harder than changing the sign, harder than the interrogation, because now he understood the full weight of resistance. It was not merely about killing the enemy. It was about carrying the burden of collateral damage, about living with the knowledge that innocent people died because of choices you made. Following the executions, the German presence in the village intensified rather than diminished. They established a permanent garrison, converting the village hall into a military outpost. Patrols increased. Curfews became stricter. The entire area was placed beneath martial law. Every resident was required to carry identity papers at all times. Random searches became daily occurrences. The boy's life shrank to a careful routine of school, home, and silence. He stopped venturing into the forest. He stopped meeting with the other former scouts. He became invisible, just another frightened teenager attempting to survive the occupation. But at night, alone in his room, he listened to the whispers that spread through the village like wildfire. The numbers were coming in. The Germans had lost 23 trucks in the ravine. Over 70 soldiers had died in the initial fall and the subsequent explosions. Dozens more had been injured. It was one of the single largest losses the Wehrmacht had suffered in Norway during the entire occupation. The supply line to the interior had been disrupted for weeks, and no one, not the Gestapo, not the military investigators, not the informants, had any idea who was responsible. The boy started to understand that his anonymity was both his protection and his prison. He could never tell anyone what he had accomplished. He could never claim credit. He could never share the burden of those 10 executed men with another soul. If he spoke even years later, even after the war concluded, the knowledge could spread. Someone might talk. Someone might seek revenge or recognition. The Germans possessed long memories, and even after defeat, they had collaborators and sympathizers scattered across Europe. So the secret had to die with him. He had to carry it alone through the rest of the occupation, through the liberation, through the reconstruction, through his entire life. He was 15 years old, and he had already learned the fundamental truth of underground warfare. The most effective resistance fighters are the ones whose names never appear in history books. The real heroes are the ghosts who strike and vanish, leaving only results and mysteries behind. Weeks transformed into months. The winter yielded to spring. The German garrison remained, but the intensity of their search eventually faded as other priorities demanded attention. The war was not proceeding well for the Reich. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Allied bombers were reducing German cities to rubble. The occupation forces in Norway were stretched thin, needed elsewhere, and a single act of sabotage in a remote mountain village, no matter how devastating, could not maintain their attention forever. Life in the village settled into a new, harsher normal. The executed men were buried in the churchyard. Their families grieved in silence. And the boy attended school, performed his chores, and pretended that he was just like everyone else. But every time a German convoy passed through the village, every time he heard the sound of truck engines on the mountain road, he felt a dark satisfaction. They were taking different routes now. They were checking every sign twice. They were afraid. And that fear, he realized, was its own kind of victory. The boy's act of sabotage rippled outward in ways he could never have anticipated. Within weeks, reports started circulating through the underground resistance network that operated in the shadows of occupied Norway. The story of the reverse sign spread from village to village, whispered in cellars, and passed along coded radio transmissions to the Norwegian government in exile in London. The resistance leadership could not believe it at first. The simplicity was almost insulting. No explosives, no weapons, no elaborate planning, simply a wrench and a winter storm, and one child's understanding of geography and German arrogance. But the results were undeniable. 73 enemy soldiers dead, an entire supply convoy destroyed, a major transportation route compromised, and the Germans had no one to blame, no cell to raid, no network to dismantle. It was the perfect sabotage, and it inspired others. Across Norway, resistance fighters started looking at their own landscapes with fresh eyes, identifying similar opportunities where the enemy's reliance on infrastructure could be turned against them. In the months that followed, at least a dozen copycat incidents occurred throughout occupied territories. In Denmark, a teenage girl redirected a German fuel convoy into a flooded quarry. In France, railway workers switched track signals and sent a munitions train into a dead-end tunnel where it exploded and collapsed the passage for months. In Belgium, members of the resistance repainted road markers, leading a Gestapo convoy directly into a British ambush. None of these operations achieved the same death toll as the original Norwegian incident, but together they represented a new form of warfare, one that required no formal military training, no access to weapons, no funding from Allied intelligence. All it required was local knowledge, patience, and the willingness to act. The boy in the Norwegian village had accidentally written a new chapter in the resistance handbook, and the Germans, despite their best efforts, could not counter it. How do you guard every traffic sign? How do you verify every road marker across an occupied continent? The answer was, you could not. The infrastructure they depended upon to control Europe had become a weapon aimed at their own throats. But while the resistance celebrated, the boy himself descended into a darkness he had not expected. The initial rush of victory faded rapidly, replaced by something heavier and more complicated. He started experiencing nightmares. In his dreams, he stood at the edge of the cliff, watching the trucks fall in slow motion, seeing the faces of the soldiers as they realized what was happening. Some of them appeared terrified, some appeared confused, some looked exactly like the boys from his village, young men who had been drafted into a war they did not choose. He knew they were the enemy. He knew they were occupiers. He knew that every German soldier in Norway was complicit in the oppression of his people. But knowing something intellectually and living with the emotional weight of it were two entirely different things. He had killed 73 people. He had watched 10 innocent men die because of what he did. He carried both victories and atrocities on his shoulders, and there was no one he could speak to about any of it. His behavior started to change in subtle ways that his parents noticed but could not explain. He became withdrawn, spending hours alone in his room or walking in the forest. He stopped smiling. He flinched at loud noises. When his mother asked what was wrong, he told her he was simply tired of the occupation, tired of the Germans, tired of being afraid all the time. She believed him because that description fit every Norwegian teenager in 1943. What she did not see was that her son was suffering from something that would not have a name for decades, something that soldiers returning from Vietnam would eventually call post-traumatic stress. He had gone to war without leaving his village, and the war had followed him home, hiding in his thoughts, waiting for quiet moments to ambush him with memories of explosions and executions. He learned to function through it, learned to bury the trauma beneath layers of routine and normalcy, but it never truly went away. It became part of him, a shadow that followed him everywhere. The price of striking back at an enemy that seemed invincible. As 1943 turned into 1944, the war started to shift. The Allies landed in Normandy. The Soviet army pushed westward. The Reich, which had seemed eternal and unstoppable just 2 years earlier, started to crack. In Norway, the occupation forces grew nervous, more brutal in some ways, more desperate in others. They knew they were losing. They knew the end was approaching. But they held on with savage determination, and the boy watched and waited, wondering if he would live to see liberation, or if the Germans would kill him in some final spasm of violence before they retreated. He had survived this long by being invisible, by keeping his secret locked away, by appearing to be nothing more than a frightened teenager, counting the days until freedom. But inside, where no one could see, he was still standing at that intersection in the snow, still turning that sign, still sending those trucks over the edge, over and over again forever. Liberation arrived in Norway in May of 1945, not with a dramatic battle, but with a quiet collapse. The German forces, cut off from Berlin and surrounded by Allied advances on all fronts, simply surrendered. One day, the village was occupied. The next day, the soldiers were laying down their weapons and waiting to be processed as prisoners of war. The Norwegian flag, hidden in attics and cellars for 5 long years, reappeared on every building. People flooded into the streets, crying and embracing, celebrating the end of a nightmare that had consumed their lives. The boy stood in that crowd, watching the Germans march away under guard. And he felt nothing. No joy, no relief, no sense of victory. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times during the occupation, imagined how it would feel to watch the enemy depart. But now that it was happening, all he felt was emptiness. The war was over, but the war inside him would never end. He had killed for his country. He had watched innocent people die because of his actions. And now everyone around him was celebrating as if none of it had cost anything, as if freedom had simply arrived like a gift, rather than being purchased in blood and guilt. In the weeks following liberation, the resistance emerged from the shadows. Men and women who had fought in secret for years suddenly possessed names and faces and stories. The government in exile returned from London. Medals were distributed. Ceremonies were held. The heroes of the Norwegian resistance were celebrated in newspapers and on radio broadcasts, their exploits documented and mythologized. But the boy's name never appeared in any of those stories. The incident with the convoy, while known within resistance circles, remained officially unattributed. The Norwegian authorities had their reasons for this silence. First, the saboteur had never stepped forward to claim responsibility, which made verification impossible. Second, the execution of the 10 villagers complicated the narrative. How do you celebrate an act of resistance that resulted in German reprisals against civilians? It was easier to let the story fade into ambiguity, to acknowledge that something had happened without dwelling on the messy details of who accomplished it and what it cost. And third, there was the matter of age. If the rumors were accurate, if the person responsible really was a teenage boy, then admitting it meant admitting that Norway had sent children to war, which was not the image the new government wanted to project to the world. The boy himself possessed no interest in stepping forward. He watched the celebration of other resistance fighters with a mixture of respect and distance. He understood that they deserved recognition for their bravery. But he also understood that his own story was different. What he had accomplished was not heroic in the traditional sense. It was not a fair fight. It was not soldiers against soldiers. It was a child with a wrench committing mass murder through deception, and 10 innocent men had paid the price for it. There was no way to tell that story that made anyone feel good, so he stayed silent. When his father asked if he had heard about the mysterious sabotage that had killed all those Germans, the boy shrugged and said he had heard rumors but did not know the details. When his friends speculated about who might have been responsible, he participated in the speculation, throwing out theories like everyone else, hiding in plain sight. The secret that had protected him during the occupation continued to protect him after liberation. But now it was a different kind of protection. Now it was protecting him from uncomfortable questions and moral complexity, and the burden of being called a hero for something that felt more like a sin. Years passed. The village rebuilt. The executed men were memorialized with a plaque in the church. The boy finished school, secured a job, got married, had children of his own. He lived a quiet life, The kind of life that millions of Europeans lived after the war, attempting to forget the horrors and move forward into a future that seemed impossibly fragile. He never spoke about what he had accomplished, not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone. The secret became so deeply buried that sometimes he could almost convince himself it had happened to someone else, that the boy who climbed through the snow and reversed that sign was a different person entirely. But every year, on the anniversary of that January morning, he would wake from the same nightmare, the sound of trucks falling and exploding echoing through his mind, and he would know that the past was not past, that it was still there, waiting, patient as a predator. The true scale of what he had accomplished remained hidden for decades. The German military records, captured by the Allies at the end of the war, were sealed in archives and slowly declassified over the following 50 years. It was not until the 1,990 seconds that historians, combing through those documents, discovered the complete report of the incident. The convoy had been carrying more than just supplies. It had been transporting gold bullion stolen from Norwegian banks destined for Berlin to help fund the collapsing war effort. It had been carrying classified documents detailing German defensive positions along the coast. It had been carrying a high-ranking SS officer who was traveling to inspect security arrangements at a nearby labor camp. The boy had not just killed 73 soldiers, he had disrupted a major financial transfer, compromised military intelligence, and eliminated a key figure in the occupation's command structure. By any strategic measure, it was one of the most successful single acts of sabotage in the entire Norwegian resistance, and the person responsible had been 15 years old, had used no explosives, had required no outside support, and had never told a soul. The boy, now an old man in his 70s, learned about the declassified documents by accident. It was 1997, and he was living in a small apartment in Oslo, retired from a lifetime of unremarkable work. His wife had passed away 3 years earlier. His children had moved to other cities, busy with their own lives. He spent his days reading newspapers and taking walks along the fjord, a routine that gave shape to the loneliness. One afternoon, while browsing a bookstore, he came across a new history of the Norwegian resistance. Thick and heavily footnoted, the kind of academic work that most people would find dry. But something on the back cover caught his eye. A brief mention of unresolved sabotage incidents, including a mysterious convoy disaster in 1943. He purchased the book and took it home, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the pages. When he reached the chapter about his village, about that January morning, he had to sit down. The historians had pieced together more than he ever knew. They possessed the German after-action reports. They had casualty lists. They had descriptions of the cargo. They had even interviewed some of the surviving German soldiers decades later, men who had been in vehicles further back in the convoy and had watched the trucks ahead disappear over the cliff. The book called it one of the great mysteries of the occupation. Who had accomplished it? The authors had theories. Maybe it was a team of British commandos. Maybe it was a sleeper agent from the Soviet intelligence network. Maybe it was a coordinated resistance cell that had been wiped out in the subsequent German crackdown, their identities lost forever. The possibility that it might have been a single teenager acting alone did not even appear in the speculation. It was too improbable, too simple. The authors spent pages analyzing the strategic implications, praising the unknown saboteur's understanding of German logistics and psychology, building up a phantom operative who existed only in their imaginations. The old man read it all with a strange mixture of pride and sadness. They had gotten the facts correct, but the story completely wrong. There had been no commandos, no spy networks, no master plan. There had only been a frightened boy with a wrench and a desire to hurt the people who had hurt his country. Everything else, all the strategic brilliance they attributed to the act, had been luck and geography and German overconfidence. He considered, for the first time in 50 years, telling someone the truth. He could write a letter to the historians. He could contact the Norwegian Resistance Museum. He could finally step from the shadows and claim his place in history. But every time he reached for a pen, he stopped. What would be the point? The war had been over for half a century. Most of the people who had lived through it were dead. His story would be interesting for a few weeks, maybe generate some newspaper articles, maybe earn him an invitation to speak at a memorial service, but it would also reopen old wounds. The families of the 10 executed men still resided in that village. Their grandchildren played in the same streets where their ancestors had been shot. How would they feel learning that their relatives had died because of a teenager's act of sabotage? Would they understand? Would they forgive? Or would they hate him for staying silent all these years, for letting them believe their loved ones had been victims of random German brutality rather than calculated reprisal? He could not predict their reaction, and the uncertainty kept him silent. There was also the matter of the German soldiers. 73 men had died that morning, and while they had been the enemy, while they had been part of an occupying force that committed atrocities across Europe, they had also been human beings. Some of them had probably been Nazis, true believers in the Reich's twisted ideology, but others had probably been conscripts, farm boys, and factory workers who had been drafted and sent to Norway against their will. The old man had spent decades attempting not to think about this distinction, attempting to maintain the clear moral line that had justified his action as a boy. But the older he got, the more that line blurred. He had killed people. The fact that it was war, the fact that they were occupiers, the fact that his country had been suffering under their rule, none of that changed the fundamental reality. He had taken lives, many lives, and some of those lives had probably belonged to people who were not that different from him, young men who had found themselves on the wrong side of history through no fault of their own. The book sat on his shelf for months, a physical reminder of the choice he faced: tell the truth and become a footnote in history, or take the secret to his grave and let the mystery remain unsolved. In the end, the decision was made for him by his failing health. He suffered a stroke in the winter of 1998, a major one that left him partially paralyzed and struggling to speak. His children moved him into a nursing home, where he spent his final year drifting in and out of consciousness. His mind caught between the present and the past. Sometimes he thought he was 15 again, climbing through the snow with a wrench in his backpack. Sometimes he thought he was in the classroom, listening to the explosions echo across the valley. And sometimes, in his clearest moments, he understood that he was an old man dying with a secret that would die with him. And that perhaps that was how it should be. Not every hero needs recognition. Not every act of war needs to be celebrated. Some things are better left in the fog, mysterious and unresolved, known only to the person who lived them and the ghosts who haunt their memory. The old man died in March of 1999, alone in his nursing home room on a rainy afternoon. His children arrived too late, caught in traffic, and by the time they reached his bedside, he was already gone. There was no deathbed confession, no final revelation, no last-minute decision to unburden himself of the secret he had carried for 56 years. He simply stopped breathing, and the truth went with him. His funeral was small and quiet, attended by family and a handful of elderly neighbors who remembered him as a decent man, a hard worker, someone who kept to himself but was always polite. The priest spoke about faith and resilience and the generation that had survived the war. Generic phrases that could have applied to any Norwegian of that age. No one mentioned resistance. No one mentioned heroism. No one had any idea that they were burying one of the most effective saboteurs in Norwegian history. He was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in the fjord, dissolving into the same cold water that had reflected the smoke from burning German trucks 56 years earlier. His children, while sorting through his belongings, found the book about the resistance sitting on his shelf. They flipped through it, noticed that he had dog-eared certain pages, underlined certain passages, all relating to the Convoy incident near their father's childhood village. They found this curious but not extraordinary. Many people who had lived through the occupation were interested in resistance history. It was natural that their father would want to read about events that had happened near his home. They donated the book to a local library along with the rest of his collection and thought nothing more of it. The secret, so carefully guarded, nearly survived intact. But secrets have a strange way of leaking even after death, especially when they involve documentation. The old man had kept something that his children did not find, something he had hidden years earlier, in a place he thought was safe, but which he had forgotten in the fog of his declining mind. In 2003, 4 years after his death, the apartment building where he had lived for 30 years was demolished to make way for new construction. During the demolition, workers tearing out the old radiators in what had been his unit found a small metal box wedged behind the heating pipes, covered in rust and dust. Inside the box was a diary, handwritten in Norwegian, dated 1943. The construction foreman, thinking it might be historically significant, turned it over to the Oslo Museum of Cultural History, rather than throwing it away with the rest of the debris. The museum catalogued it and filed it away, one more artifact among thousands, where it sat unread for another 6 years. It was not until 2009, when a graduate student researching daily life during the occupation requested access to personal documents from that period, that anyone actually opened the diary and read what was inside. The entries were sparse, just a few sentences here and there, the writing of a teenager who was not naturally inclined toward journaling. Most of it was mundane. Complaints about the cold, descriptions of rationing, observations about German patrols. But then, dated January 19, 1943, there was an entry that made the graduate student's breath catch in her throat. The handwriting was shakier than the other entries, as if written by someone whose hands were trembling. It read in Norwegian, translated here to English. "I did it last night. Changed the sign at the fork. The storm covered my tracks. No one saw me. This morning the convoy came. I heard the explosions from school. So many explosions, more than I thought. They are questioning everyone now. 10 men were shot today because of what I did. I do not know if I am a hero or a murderer. I do not know if God will forgive me. I do not know if I will ever sleep again without hearing those sounds. But they are dead. 73 of them are dead, and I am alive and I will never tell." The graduate student brought the diary to her faculty advisor, who brought it to the museum, director who brought it to a panel of historians specializing in World War II and the Norwegian resistance. They examined the diary for authenticity, checking the paper, the ink, the handwriting consistency across all entries. They cross-referenced the dates and details with known historical events. They tracked down the old man's family and obtained DNA samples to compare against saliva residue on the diary's pages. Every test confirmed what the diary claimed. It was genuine. The mystery that had puzzled historians for 66 years had been solved by a forgotten journal hidden behind a radiator. The unknown saboteur finally had a name, an identity, a human face. The boy who had reversed the sign was real, and he had been exactly what the historians thought was impossible. A 15-year-old scout acting entirely alone, driven by nothing more than anger and opportunity, and the kind of reckless courage that only comes from youth. The revelation of the diary created a firestorm in Norwegian historical circles and beyond. Within weeks, the story had spread from academic journals to international news outlets. Major newspapers in London, New York, Paris, and Berlin ran features about the Boy Scout who had single-handedly decimated a German convoy using nothing but a wrench and local knowledge. Documentary filmmakers began calling the museum, requesting access to the diary and permission to interview the man's surviving family. The Norwegian government, which had unknowingly overlooked one of its greatest resistance heroes for over 6 decades, scrambled to correct the historical record. They added his name to the National Resistance Memorial in Oslo. They issued a posthumous medal, the War Cross with Sword, the highest military decoration Norway awards for exceptional bravery. His children, now elderly themselves and stunned by the discovery, were invited to the royal palace, where the King of Norway personally apologized for the decades of silence and thanked them for their father's sacrifice. It was a moment of national pride and collective guilt, a recognition that the most extraordinary acts of courage sometimes come from the most unlikely sources and are often hidden in plain sight for generations. But the story also reignited painful debates about the nature of resistance and the cost of fighting tyranny. The families of the 10 executed villagers, descendants now 3 generations removed from the events, had mixed reactions. Some expressed pride that their ancestors had unwittingly died as part of a successful military operation against the occupiers. Others expressed anger that they had spent their entire lives believing their relatives had been murdered for nothing, when in reality they had been killed in reprisal for an act of sabotage that had never been claimed or acknowledged. Online forums and newspaper comment sections filled with arguments about whether the boys' action had been justified, whether the death of 10 innocents was an acceptable price for killing 73 enemy soldiers, whether a 15-year-old could truly understand the consequences of such a decision. The debate was heated and often vicious, reflecting deeper disagreements about war, morality, and the impossible choices that occupation forces upon ordinary people. Some called him a hero. Some called him a murderer. Most recognized that he was both. That war creates situations where heroism and atrocity become inseparable, where the same act can be simultaneously noble and horrific, depending on which side of the cliff you are standing on. The diary itself became a touring exhibit displayed in museums across Norway and eventually in other countries that had experienced Nazi occupation. People lined up for hours to see the small rust-stained journal, to read the shaky handwriting of a traumatized teenager processing an act of violence that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The entry about the execution of the 10 villagers was particularly powerful, a raw admission of guilt and confusion that contrasted sharply with the triumphant narratives usually associated with resistance stories. Educators began using the diary in schools as a teaching tool, not to glorify war or violence, but to illustrate the complexity of moral decision-making under extreme circumstances. Students were asked to put themselves in the boys' position, to consider what they would have done, to grapple with the reality that sometimes there are no good choices, only terrible ones, and slightly less terrible ones. The diary became a reminder that history is not clean, that heroes are not perfect, and that the people who fight for freedom often carry scars that never fully heal. Perhaps the most unexpected consequence of the diary's discovery was its impact on historical methodology itself. The incident proved that even in the most documented conflict in human history, even in a war where millions of pages of records were kept and preserved, enormous gaps still existed. How many other acts of resistance had gone unrecorded? How many other heroes had taken their secrets to the grave? How many stories had been lost because the people who lived them were too traumatized, too humble, or too afraid to tell? The Norwegian resistance archives were reopened and re-examined with fresh eyes. Historians began actively seeking out hidden diaries, forgotten letters, and obscure family documents that might contain similar revelations. The search expanded to other occupied countries, and slowly more stories began to emerge. A Belgian schoolteacher who had hidden Allied pilots in her attic for 3 years. A French railway worker who had sabotaged hundreds of locomotives through subtle mechanical failures. A Polish nun who had smuggled Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto disguised as typhus victims. Each story had been invisible to history, preserved only in private documents that had been stored away and forgotten. The boy's diary had opened a door, and behind that door was an entire hidden dimension of the war, populated by ordinary people who had done extraordinary things and then vanished back into anonymity. Today, 75 years after that January morning in 1943, the story of the Boy Scout and the reversed traffic sign has become part of Norwegian national memory, taught in schools and commemorated in monuments. A plaque now stands at the intersection where he changed the sign, marking the spot where one teenager's act of defiance killed more enemy soldiers than some entire resistance operations. But the real legacy of his story is not the body count or the strategic impact. The real legacy is the reminder that resistance does not always come from trained soldiers or intelligence operatives or political leaders. Sometimes it comes from children. Sometimes it comes from people who have no business being at war, but who find themselves in the middle of one anyway and decide that doing nothing is not an option. The boy with the wrench proved that you do not need an army to fight tyranny. You just need courage, opportunity, and the willingness to live with the consequences of your actions for the rest of your life. His story was buried for decades, forgotten by everyone except the ghosts that haunted his dreams. But now, it lives on as a testament to the power of individual action and the price of freedom. And maybe, just maybe, that is exactly what he would have wanted to be remembered, not as a hero or a killer, but as a reminder that even in the darkest times, even when the enemy seems invincible, there is always someone willing to stand up and fight back. No matter how young, no matter how scared, no matter the cost.